there's going to be popping of corks of champagne in the White House. But ironically, the real lamentations are going to be coming from places like Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Because Herzog, who is the primary opponent for Benjamin Netanyahu, has said that he trusts President Obama to get a good deal with Iran.
Popping champagne corks? Well, that's what former Arkansas governor and possible 2016 presidential candidate Mike Huckabee says will happen at the White House should Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu lose in today's Israeli elections. As we welcome you in to America's Forum on this Tuesday, St. Patrick's Day. Sorry, no green for us because of technical challenges.
Right.
There are challenges ahead in Israel. With Miranda Khan, J.D. Hayworth, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no doubt about that. This as reports surface of a powerful Senate committee launching a bipartisan probe into an American non-for-profit's funding of efforts to help oust the Israeli prime minister using taxpayer-funded grants provided to them by the Obama administration.
Meanwhile, Mr. Netanyahu said in an interview that if he does return to office for a fourth term as prime minister, he will not support a Palestinian state. For more on these developing stories from Israeli Election Day, let's bring in Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz, the author of Terror Tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. Alan's also a blogger for Newsmax.com, and we're also pleased to be joined from Newsmax Washington by former Illinois Congressman Michael Patrick Flanagan. Gentlemen, our thanks to you both. Alan, let's begin with you. You heard what Mike Huckabee had to say. Do you agree with his assessment?
First of all, happy St. Patrick's Day to all my Irish friends, and today we're all Irish. I don't agree. I don't think there'll be any champagne cork popping because I don't think the election will be determined necessarily today. In Israel, virtually every election is like our election in the year 2000 when we didn't know the results for weeks or months thereafter. There'll be an outcome today. We'll know how many seats each of the parties or groups have gotten, and then the real negotiations begin. The relatively new president of Israel will have to get recommendations from each of the parties that have substantial numbers as to which leader will be asked to form a government. Then there'll be all kinds of negotiations with the parties, and some of the strangest coalitions may emerge. So I don't think you can count out Netanyahu, even if he ends up losing by 3, 4, or even 5 seats, though it is certainly possible there may be a change of government. If there is a change in government and Herzog becomes the clear prime minister, I think the White House will be cheering, and I think the governor is right. There'll be some regret from mixed feelings, at least, from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, that really want a strong Israeli prime minister to stand up against ISIS and to stand up against Iran.
Professor Dershowitz, good morning.
Good morning.
The Guardian reports that the coalition is likely to favor Netanyahu's return to prime minister, even though the Likud party may run second. And I was doing all this reading this morning because anytime I'm on with Professor Dershowitz, I have to do my homework. So I've done as much reading as I can. But the long and the short of it is that even if the Chicago guys have their way and the early and often pays off, and they get their Herzog to a primary position, it's likely that Netanyahu may still be prime minister, forming a coalition from behind because the numbers favor him now. Is that so?
Well, that's certainly possible. You know, the interesting thing will be how the Arab list does. This is very good for democracy. Many more Arabs are going to vote in this election. Israeli Arabs, Israelis who are of Arab background, both Christian and Muslim, will vote in this election, and they may emerge as the third or fourth strongest bloc, and they may become kingmakers. Interesting, of course, the Arab list comprises communists who may very well even support Assad in Syria because the Russians and the Iranians do, fundamentalists who probably hate the communists, a group of feminists, and a group of kind of secular Arabs. So it's going to be so interesting to see how that coalition plays out in the maneuvering that occurs thereafter. Likud is not going to be able to form a coalition with them. But their leader has said they may be willing to form a coalition with Herzog. So, anybody who's betting today on the outcome of this election is making a fool's bet. Nobody can know until weeks after, unless there's a decisive victory. If there's a decisive victory on one side or another, then we'd know by midnight tonight who's going to be the next prime minister. I think that's an unlikely, though a possible result.
Well, a whole lot of things are possible when you're dealing with different parties and the permutation of coalitions. It's a different kind of election day in a parliamentary democracy than what we have here in a constitutional republic. We'll be back with Messrs. Flanagan and Dershowitz and have more right after this. Welcome back to America's Forum. You are looking live at a polling station in Israel, as this is Israeli Election Day, in addition to being St. Patrick's Day around the world. And as we've just heard, the voting takes place today, but in all likelihood, the bargaining and the coalition building has yet to occur. With Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth back with you. And Miranda, a very troubling headline seen on the cover of Atlantic magazine. It asked the question, is it time for the Jews to leave Europe?
The article goes on to say that for half a century, memories of the Holocaust limited anti-Semitism, but now that period may have ended.
Let's continue our conversation with Harvard Law professor and Newsmax blogger Alan Dershowitz and our good friend, former Congressman Michael Patrick Flanagan. Alan, today's election and its international impact. You see the headline from the Atlantic, the headline very troubling to say the least.
Yeah, I just came back from a trip to Europe. I was in Prague, I was in Berlin, Dresden, Nuremberg, Cologne, Paris. I think Jews are secure in most parts of large cities, but not in some neighborhoods, to be sure. And there's one very, very nasty form of Holocaust denial that's become very prevalent, even among many academics in Europe. And that Holocaust denial is the thing that says that what the Jews are doing to the Palestinians now in Israel is equivalent to what the Nazis did to the Jews. Now, why is that Holocaust denial? Because if all the Nazis did to the Jews was, build a few settlements, displace a few people, maybe overreact, taking it at its worst case, to some rockets, then there were no gas chambers, there were no killing squads. And that's a form of Holocaust denial that's become very popular at Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, and it's spreading to some American universities. And it's interesting that it's tolerated on college campuses, that comparison between Israel's actions in self-defense against terrorists and the Nazis' genocidal plan to kill 10 million Jews, which succeeded in killing 6 million Jews. So we're seeing increases in anti-Semitism all through Europe. From the extreme right in Greece and Hungary to the academic left in Paris and London, and to many Muslims who express anti-Semitic views as well. It's uncomfortable for Jews in Europe, but Jews have the right to live anywhere they choose. When I went to Paris recently, I don't usually wear a kippah, head covering. I'm not particularly religious in that way. But when I was in Paris, I wore a kippah. I wanted everybody to know that Jews have the right to express their religion, to wear a Star of David, just like Christians have the right to wear a cross, and the state has an obligation to protect everyone who expresses their religious views.
Alan, I want to talk a minute about the vow made by Mr. Netanyahu to not support a Palestinian state if he returns to office for a fourth term. You yourself have said here on America's Forum that you support a Palestinian state. Will this work for him or against him?
You never know. It sounds like a kind of desperate move at the last minute. What he should have said, and I think what would make some sense, is that at this point in time, for Israel to completely withdraw its military from the West Bank in light of the threat of ISIS coming into Jordan would not be acceptable at this point in time. But you could have a disarmed Palestinian state with some Israeli presence or some multinational presence headed by the United States, perhaps Egypt and other countries, in the West Bank to secure it militarily. And I would hope that if Netanyahu were to be reelected as prime minister, he would go back to the negotiating table and consider the possibility of a demilitarized Palestinian state with some military Israeli presence to protect the borders between Jordan and the West Bank against any incursion by ISIS or any Hamas takeover.
Alan, in Chicago, elections are very hands-on. They're busing your people to the polls, dragging friends and neighbors. Early and often is, you don't even have to say vote early and often, you just understand what early and often means. And it seems that in Israel, the elections are a little less hands-on, they're a little more quiet, a little more courtly, if you'll permit the term. But this time, the folks helping out on the left seem to have gotten that sort of busing thing working, getting the people out to the polls. Do you think that might have caught the Netanyahu folks a little flat-footed?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I don't like Americans trying to interfere in Israeli elections. I don't like Israelis trying to interfere in American elections. I think elections are for the citizens of the country. But, you know, Israel has hired, both sides have hired pollsters from America, political operatives from America. And I think we're seeing more Chicago-style politics in Israel this time around. We know that Netanyahu today made a statement saying the left is busing Arabs in to vote. My assessment is that Arabs are voting today because for the first time, they really feel that they are full citizens and have a potential to have an impact on this government. So rather than being outsiders, I think that they're voting. I think that's a good thing. And if one of the coalitions can include some moderate Arabs in the leadership, that would be a good thing.
We will see what happens. Unfortunately, our time grows short. Alan Dershowitz, we thank you, and we'll be right back after this.